Hey, everybody, welcome to week 3 of our short course, How Christians Can Respond to Our Culture's Brokenness. It's actually kind of week 4, I guess, because we started out with a free webinar with Ed Stetzer talking specifically about the coronavirus, and we've carried on from there. And I'm really excited about this evening. We've addressed so many other issues, including sexual brokenness with Ricky Chalette last week, but really grateful for Dr. Ben Mitchell. He and I have a long history, I have to say. He was one of my favorite professors at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where I did my master's work, and has since gone on to Union University. And he has been probably one of, if not the premier Southern Baptist ethicist in America, specifically dealing with issues of bioethics, everything from artificial intelligence to robotics, everything having to do with humanness. And I really owe a big development in my understanding of Christian worldview, Ben, to you. And I don't know if I've ever actually said this, but you came before I went to Trinity. I was looking at grad schools. You came and spoke for 3 days at Bryan College, where I was on the staff there, and you were asking a question that in my study of worldview hadn't really been dealt with. We had talked about questions around origin, where did everything come from, meaning, morality, and destiny, these questions that worldviews answer differently and that make a big difference for how we structure life together and understand our existence and everything else. But your question that week is what does it mean to be one of us? Which has become the central question of Western civilization. Maybe it always is, but in a new way. We've talked a lot about this with the collision of the sexual revolution. The question of identity is core. And tonight you're going to be addressing one aspect of that. We often talk about pro-life at the front end of life, but what does it mean to embrace the understanding of human dignity and value in the image of God at the end of life? And we have some very significant cultural demographics that are making that a front and center issue. And I don't want to steal your thunder, but I know this is something that you think about not only as an ethicist, but also as a son right now. And a lot of people find themselves in that place. And this is just such an important conversation. Add that to, the distance that families travel apart and live apart, and add that, of course, to the coronavirus and what that means. I mean, the heartbreaking stories of people not being able to say goodbye to their loved ones. We've had a couple of ministry friends, a good friend of mine whose dad, they were really worried about in Chicago. Praise God, he pulled through, but hearing those same sorts of echoes of concern. So that's where we're going to talk about tonight. This is an area of cultural brokenness. What do we do? And how do we love people through the end stages of their life? And so that's what we're going to talk about. I'll give a formal introduction here to Ben in a second. Let me just remind everyone kind of the house rules here. We want you to interact. Dr. Mitchell is going to be speaking here for the next several minutes and giving a presentation. We'll have a PowerPoint slide. We'll be sure to send you within 24 hours or so, both the clip to the recording of tonight, as well as his PowerPoint presentation, so that you can actually review all of that. And we want you to interact, because after that time of presentation, we're just going to take as many questions as we can get to. Now, remember, you have two ways to communicate with us. One is the chat button. The other is the Q&A button. Any sort of technical challenges or difficulties or questions that you have, send those through the chat button. And that Heidi there is the genius behind the curtain that's making sure all of these trains run on time. And so she will be able to address any of the concerns you have there. And then any questions that you have having to do with the content of tonight's presentation, send that through the Q&A box. I want to begin just by opening with prayer, and then I'll introduce Dr. Ben Mitchell in a formal way, and we'll get started. Father, we're grateful to be together tonight virtually. It's not the same, and many of us are experiencing that, where it's not the same as being able to hug people and to sit closely with people, especially our loved ones. And certainly this group that we're going to talk about tonight, this group of image bearers, that is a growing demographic in the West, and also an aging demographic. This presents all kinds of new challenges. And we are a culture that's dominated by efficiency, which it starts us off right off the bat on the wrong foot when we're talking about human value and human dignity. I'm grateful, God, for the influence that Dr. Mitchell has had in my life, for the contribution that he has made to Christian thought in this area and in so many other areas of culture and bioethics, including technology and everything else. And I ask that you would strengthen him and equip him and give us ears to hear tonight, we pray. In Christ's name, amen. Well, as soon as I introduce you, Dr. Mitchell, I'm going to disappear and you're going to have the screen to yourself. But as I mentioned, Dr. Ben Mitchell is a premier Southern Baptist bioethicist. He now teaches at Union University and dealing with the social distance of a Christian college not being able to be together, which is a challenge in and of itself, but has published widely in this area, has been a long time fellow at the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity as well. Spent a lot of time up at Trinity International University, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which is where he and I met. And Ben, we're just grateful to have you here tonight. I'm going to turn the floor, the virtual floor, over to you now.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for the good work of the Colson Center. It is a go-to resource for me, and I appreciate the ministry and work of the center. And it's been a great joy to partner with John, both in his earlier education, but also in projects like these. And it's just very encouraging to see young men and young women continue to be faithful and to occupy such strategic roles as heading the Colson Center. Well, my talk tonight, and it's going to be relatively brief because I'm more interested in responding to your questions and our having as much as possible a kind of conversation. But my discussion this evening, my talk this evening will focus on end-of-life care. There are 100 different directions we could go. So I'm going to just pick up some major threads and pull those threads a little bit, a few themes that we could talk about that I think are significant and important, and then we'll have a conversation together. John alluded to the fact that this topic is more than a topic of professional interest insofar as I lost my mother back in November of metastatic lung cancer, and walking with her through her journey to her last days, and now walking with my dad has been a challenge and an opportunity. It's been a blessing to be able to do that, but it comes with lots of different issues and challenges of its own. So I speak as somebody who is walking through this, and if you are walking through this, I know something of what you're going through. And if you aren't walking through this journey right now, you will. We'll see that in just a moment. So I'm going to try to share my screen. We're going to rely on technology. And Heidi, would you tell me if you can see my screen now?
Yes, it looks good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to talk about end-of-life care, and I want to ask you well, I'm a professor. I'm a classroom professor, as John said. My life as a classroom professor has become more of an online experience lately, with all the technological challenges that may bring, including the fact that my slide is not wanting to advance right this second, but let me see what I can do. There we go. So as a classroom teacher, I have to begin with a quiz. And I know you haven't had time to prepare for the quiz. That's okay. That's what I really like. I really love surprising people with quiz questions. But my quiz question for this evening is, what modern technology has changed the way people die in America? Notice modern technology, so recent technology. What modern technology has changed the way people die in America? And I can imagine many different answers running through your mind. But as a matter of fact, in my view, that technology which has changed most the way people die in America and in the West in general is flexible plastic tubing. Flexible plastic tubing. Now, why would I say that? Well, because the way people died before flexible plastic tubing and for millennia before flexible plastic tubing was to have some kind of disease or illness or event in their lives that led to either the cessation of their breathing or the cessation of their heartbeat. And the way that we dealt with those who were dying was simply to comfort them, to care for them, and then to wait for death to occur, because there was very little else we could do. There might have been a treatment, or might have been a sulfur drug or something like that that could be administered, but for the most part, we could not sustain the human body beyond the cessation of heartbeat and respiration or breathing. And we can do that now. And we can administer many other medications and therapies with flexible plastic tubing. And our discussion about ventilators during this COVID-19 crisis would not have been had were it not for the flexible plastic tubing that allows the ventilator to breathe for a patient. So something so simple, so mundane, so apparently unimportant has radically changed the way people die. Dying and death are a universal experience of humanity. And here we have it in the ancient language of the Bible from the writer of Ecclesiastes. There is a time to be born and a time to die. It is inevitable. It is part of the human experience after the fall. It is one of those experiences that we all share, no matter our ethnicity, no matter our class, no matter our backgrounds, no matter our location. We will share this experience of death and dying. There's a time to be born and a time to die. And so it's important that we talk about end-of-life care. And I think some of the reasons, at least, that it's important we have this conversation is to help us live in the light of our mortality, to remember that we are mortal, to remember that we too must die. And then this conversation can help us become aware of resources that are available, both to help us die and then to help us care better for the dying. And whether those are personal or familial or professional or community-based resources, having this conversation can help us learn about those resources. And we may learn of some in your particular locale this evening in our question and answer time. It helps us prepare as citizens and neighbors. I mean, I think it's remarkable. I have to confess, I have a little bit of COVID-19 fatigue, like most of you do. It seems to occupy all of our news media and our social media. But it is true that as citizens and as neighbors living in a community, as we do, or worshiping in churches, this helps us prepare better to care for one another and to bear one another's burdens. So I think that's an important feature of this conversation. I think theological issues are often ignored in the culture, as you would be aware, and I want to put forward or bring to the front burner some theological affirmations and doctrines that I think will help us sort through some of the ethical issues here. Many of us have been put in the role of caregivers for those who are dying, and I think this conversation can help us be better prepared to do that, and then of course to help us die well ourselves. I'm not going to talk about it directly this evening, but this is not a new conversation for Christians, of course. In fact, in a time of plague in the medieval period, Christians wrote a volume called the Ars Moriendi, the Art of Dying, which was meant to help Christians prepare for death. It was a time of plague. It was a time when thousands upon thousands were dying of the Black Plague. And so Christians at that time thought they needed a manual to help them prepare to meet their Maker. And so Ars Moriendi, the Art of Dying, was the name of that volume. It's still around. You can search for it on the internet. Ars Moriendi, ARSMORIEND, IND, Moriendi, DE, yes, in this case. And there's a wonderful volume on this topic by the late Alan Verhey, Verhey, Alan Verhey, on the Christian Art of Dying. Alan wrote this almost literally on his deathbed. He'd already been diagnosed with cancer and wrote this volume while he was dying. And it's an extraordinary, extraordinary study of both the book, The Art of Dying, and also an extraordinary study of how a Christian faces the prospect of dying, as Alan did. He was a wonderful colleague. So if I ask you tonight, how do you want to die? I guess, again, it's just experience that tells me that most of us would say the way we want to die is quickly. We want to be doing something we enjoy or be around people that we care about, and then we just want to have a massive heart attack and die. I think that's probably our intuition. But I want you to know that is a very contemporary notion. In fact, from this old litany of the saints, and I put the Latin here only to not to reveal the answer too soon, but in this litany of the saints, the prayer was offered from a death that is sudden and unprepared for. Deliver us, O Lord. From a death that's sudden and unprepared for, deliver us, O Lord. That is a foreign concept in the minds of most contemporary people in general, and Christians in particular. And I think it's instructive that Christians in the past thought that a sudden death, a death that you couldn't prepare for, was something to be avoided. And I wonder, I wish, and maybe we can have a conversation about this during the Q&A. I wonder why they thought that, why you think they thought that. And part of the answer is, of course, that they wanted time to reconcile with loved ones or reconcile with others. They wanted time to repent of their sins and cleanse their conscience. They wanted time to prepare to meet the God who made them and loved them and redeemed them, and in whose presence they were going to be ushered. They wanted time to prepare. And I hope that our prayer can increasingly become this prayer, that we would be able to prepare ourselves and help our loved ones prepare to die. We'd have that time to do that. We're having more time as a species, as Homo sapiens. Our life expectancy continues to grow on average, and it's projected that by the year 2050, the average life expectancy will be 90 years. We already have many centurions among us, and I don't mean people who have finished the Colson course, the centurions, but we have many centurions, people who are over 100 among us now, and will increasingly, as far as we can tell, have centurions among us. So we're seeing average life expectancy grow. But it's interesting, we're also seeing life expectancy connected with gross domestic product. That is to say, the better off one is financially, economically, the higher, the healthier the culture, the longer people tend to live. So that has implications for both our mission, especially in helping underdeveloped countries to develop, but also it has implications for our sense of care for those who are less fortunate than ourselves and whose life expectancy, through no fault of their own perhaps, their life expectancy is decreased just because of the culture in which they live. At the same time, while we're living longer and while our life expectancy is connected with our affluence, the cost of dying is escalating, and funeral costs continue to rise, and it's created some very, very interesting dynamics. There are, for instance, I don't have the slide on here, but I often show my students a slide of the Walmart webpage for caskets. And Walmart and Costco and big box stores like that now have a separate line of caskets and urns for cremation that they make available because they assume that people are price shopping when it comes to death and dying. And so you can go to Walmart and search for caskets, and a whole page will appear in front of you of different casket choices through those kinds of stores. So the costs of dying have implications. How will these unidentified, well, not how will they unidentified, but how will people who are on very meager incomes afford to care for the bodies of their dead relatives? It's a challenge for many. And it's all related, in many ways, related to Western attitudes toward death. I highly recommend this book by Philippe Ariz, The Hour of Our Death, where he examines the evolution of our attitudes in the West toward death. The first wave of our attitudes toward death was trying to tame it, somehow to hold it back and tamp it down. And we were going to find ways to tame this thing called death. And eventually, when we saw, I think, that we couldn't tame it, or at least we couldn't tame it the way we wanted to, we became a death-denying culture. I'll say more about that in a moment, but we became a death-denying culture, and death became invisible. Death is something we outsource. Death is something that we let hospitals take care of or nursing homes take care of. When in the past, and again for millennia, death was something that typically happened at home or on the job or in the field, and the body would be brought back to the house. If you died at home, you died in your bed, and the family would gather around, and after you had died, an undertaker would come to the house, prepare your body, probably right in your bed, and you would lie in state during a wake or a period of visitation until you were taken to the grave. Death could not have been outsourced then, but now we deny it. We've tried to make it invisible, and we've become a largely death-denying culture. And now, as a result of that, we also have become a mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, denying culture, so that grief after someone has died, after a family member has died, is something that you're supposed to get over. How long is it going to take you to get over that? My dad has said so many times, I just can't get over this. And mom's only been gone now 4 months. So death and grief are something we're supposed to get over in a hurry. Efficiency, again, even in our grieving process, is something we're supposed to participate in. And look, I mean, that's again a very recent reality. In the past, remember, widows would wear black for a year after the death of their spouse. as a symbol of mourning, and we expected people to grieve for long periods of time. Now we give you paid time off, your bereavement leave, and when you get back from your 3 days of bereavement leave, we expect you to go right back to work and right back to life just as it was before the death. It's a we've now said, as Ivan Ilyich does in the death of Ivan Ilyich, as Tolstoy does in the death of Ivan Ilyich, mourning is now indecent. It's not something that proper people do. And then most recently, we have medicalized death. We have, it's data driven. It's something that's tracked by insurance companies, and we have medicalized the whole experience of death and outsourced it to the medical community. And I think that's because we, a little bit like Woody Allen, we want to say that we're not afraid to die. We just don't want to be there when it happens. And I think there's still a great deal of fear of death, even among Christians, and certainly a great deal of denial of death, even among Christians, that it seems to me is at best unfortunate, and at worst prevents us from either experiencing the reality ourselves or with our families, or helping others prepare for it. We use euphemisms to describe death. We've kicked the bucket off the farm. They passed, not passed away. You often hear people say, oh, they just passed. Well, somebody passed on the interstate too, and that was a very different experience. They are the dearly departed who've gone to their reward. He was on his last legs, but he's now down for the long count. Or here's how we medicalize it. We've had a negative patient outcome. We are a death-denying culture. Now, what's changed? What's changed is COVID-19. We can no longer deny the reality of death. Here in this chart, you see a comparative analysis of the curve of death, the escalating curve of death under COVID-19 over against the relatively flat curve of the way people die of other causes in the United States. It's been an extraordinary, even though horrific, experience for us as a country, and for some of you, I'm sure, as families. But what it's meant is that it's less possible for us to deny the reality of death because we are confronted by it every day. The cost of denying death is that we fail to acknowledge the dying person's situation. We fail to acknowledge just how that person experiences death. And then on the other hand, we sometimes give false reassurance to people who are dying. Oh, you're going to be okay. Excuse me. It's going to be all right. You're not going to die. Of course, you're not going to die. And we give people those false reassurances and prevent them from preparing their own souls to die. And then we often, and now of course we have to because of this virus, but even prior to that, we superstitiously avoided touching people who were dying, somehow thinking that experience was going to contaminate us in some way, at a time when people most need to feel the experience of human touch. So we can't deny it today, or we shouldn't deny it today. And it's interesting to see how the way we die today has changed. And notice on the left-hand side of your screen, 1900, turn of the last century, the way most people died was to have a sickness of some sort that led to a a relatively quick death. There was little we could do to treat terminal illnesses. So if you had a massive heart attack, you died pretty quickly. But even of other causes, consumption and other TB and other causes, you died relatively quickly. After the turn of the millennium, and certainly in 2020, our experience of sickness is prolonged. We live with illness much longer than we used to, and we more likely than not slowly move toward death. On the right-hand screen, you see how this changes depending on one's diagnosis. For instance, most cancer deaths have a long period of illness, followed by a very short period of decline and then death. For those who have other illnesses like heart failure, lung failure, what we see is that patients are diagnosed with an illness, they get sick, and then they have a event of some sort, like they go into the hospital, have to have care, and then they recover. But notice on that curve, they don't quite recover as to the same level they were before their hospitalization or their event. And then they have another event. And then they might have a period where they continue to decline, and then there's another event. And then finally there is an event that takes them to a hospital perhaps, and they don't recover, and they die. And then because of our longevity, because we are living longer, and at least in some cases living healthier lives, now in old age we tend to dwindle, and now increasingly individuals and family members are experiencing frailty, dementia, that's age-related dementia, and other issues that are a result of the fact that we're living now into our 90s and into our hundreds. So that's, I think these graphs are just a reminder that there are some similarities in how we die, but there are also some significant differences that give us opportunities either to prepare ourselves or our family members for those opportunities, or to serve and minister to people who are dying in those situations. We know that death, whether we have a mixed relationship with death. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, in that wonderful text that I hope that you have read or heard proclaimed during Easter, Paul reminds us the last enemy to be destroyed is death. There will be a time when there's no more weeping, there's no more grieving, there's no more weeping over the death of a loved one. But even then, I mean, even that being the case, there is this paradox that we find ourselves grappling with all the time. On one hand, at least in a fallen world, death is natural. It's inevitable. It's something we're all going to experience. It's something we should all be preparing for. At the same time, it's entirely unnatural because it's a result of our fallen condition, and something which we will one day be freed from. It is in some cases a friend. I and you know of people who have suffered many years as they're dying. Their lives have been very fragile and very uncomfortable and very desperate. And in one sense, death becomes a friend to them. At the same time, as Paul reminds us, it is that last enemy that is to be destroyed. So we live with this paradox of death. It's friend and enemy, natural and unnatural. And I think that's one of the reasons we struggle sometimes with how to deal with the reality. So let me shift gears just a little bit as we're preparing for our conversation. what are the kinds of ethical issues we should be thinking about at the end of life as we're preparing or as we're caring for people who are facing death? Well, my colleagues and friends at Mayo Clinic, I have a very good friend that you would love to meet, and some of you might even know, named Chris Hook, who actually founded the ethics program at the Mayo Clinic. Chris is still very active. He's a clinician, a hematologist at Mayo, and now chairs the ethics committee of the Christian Medical and Dental Association. Chris and his colleagues published an article in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings some years ago where they identified some of the issues that arise at the end of life, especially among geriatric patients, people who are getting older. How do we ensure informed consent? How do we make sure that these patients who are near the end of their lives, maybe who are suffering dementia, how do we ensure that they actually have some decision making in what happens to them in their treatment and care? How do we maintain patient confidentiality when families are often making those decisions? How do we determine decision-making capacity? When does someone lose the capacity to make decisions for themselves? How do we ensure that they know that there are advanced directives, ADs here as advanced directives, like living wills and durable powers of attorney for healthcare? How do we make sure that they could utilize those instruments in a way that will help them extend their decision-making capacity past the time when they're able to make those decisions themselves? What about cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR? We live with a myth in the West about CPR. Our myth is that just because what we've seen on television and the movies is that most people who receive CPR, chest compressions, and the bag that breathes for somebody in an emergency, most people who receive CPR, the myth is they get up, they recover, they go home. The reality is that statistically speaking, most people who receive CPR do not survive, and many people, especially those who are elderly, can be injured during the efforts to resuscitate them. Their bones are very brittle, and when in trying to do the chest compressions, you can break bones doing CPR. So when is it appropriate to do CPR? When is it not appropriate to do CPR? And who decides? Who's the one who decides for a do not resuscitate order when we're not going to do CPR if a patient arrests in the hospital or at home? How do we allocate healthcare resources in a just way? Statistics change from time to time, depends on who you're listening to, but one of the memes that's going around all the time is that we use up the majority of our healthcare dollars in the last year of life. The healthcare dollars that we use during the course of our lifetime, most of us will use up those healthcare dollars in the last year of life. What does that mean? How do we prepare? How do we allocate scarce medical resources when that's the case? And how do we provide care for patients who are unable to care for themselves in nursing homes and in assisted living, et cetera? So those are important questions. Who should we ask about those questions? Well, first of all, let's ask the people who might want them or might have a stake in whether they live or die, and how they face these things. So one group of colleagues published the results of a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association about what people feared at the end of life and what they desired at the end of life. And they found, and they did this study of 126 patients, and what people fear is dying on a machine. And you often, when you're talking to people over a cup of coffee, and you talk about death and dying, one of the things they'll often say is, well, I just don't want to die on a machine. And I think many people feel that way. They don't want to be kept alive beyond what their time should be, so to speak, on a machine. They don't want to be uncomfortable. They don't want to die alone. They don't want to be a burden on their loved ones. They don't want a long dying process, and they don't want to die in an institution. They want to die at home. And the reality is that most people don't die at home anymore. Most people die in some kind of institution. There must be a better way, and I hope we can talk about that, how people can die in comfort with their loved ones and still maintain some kind of control and make this a meaningful experience in their lives and the lives of their loved ones. The largest study I know on this topic was done back at the turn of the last century by Karen Steinhauser and her colleagues, published again in Journal of the American Medical Association. I don't know that this study has been replicated, but it was the question was what factors are considered important at the end of life by patients, family members, physicians, and other care providers. And this was a huge study of 340 seriously ill patients, 332 recently bereaved family members, more than 300 physicians, almost 500 nurses. And so you had a huge population being studied and offering what they thought was important at the end of life. And notice this is interesting. The 99% of those who responded, but whether they were physicians, patients, nurses, family members, said that the number one priority was to be kept clean. Hygiene and cleanliness was the major factor for them. They wanted to be able to name their decision maker. If I can't make decisions for myself, who do I want to make those decisions? I want to have a caregiver, a nurse that I feel comfortable with, that's not a stranger, or that isn't treating me like a stranger. I want to know about my condition. I want information about what's going on. I don't want to be kept in the dark. I want to maintain my dignity. I want you to underscore that one in your mind. Maintain my dignity. John said in the introduction that one of the questions we've been grappling with is, what does it mean to be one of us? That is to say, what does it mean to be a human being made in God's image? And I know what people mean, I think, when they say, I want to maintain my dignity, but is human dignity something we can lose? And is the fact that we are experiencing whatever the pangs of dying are, does that rob us of our dignity, or is there something else there? Is there something else we need to attend to? Patients want to trust their physician. They want to be free of pain. They want to have their financial affairs in order. You can read these and look at them yourselves. That study is available online. You can find that, and you'll be getting this PowerPoint if you wish. Notice the difference between the patients and physicians, though. Same study, comparing this time what patients think is top of the order and what physicians do. Both of them identify freedom from pain. I'll come back to that in a second. Peace with God was something patients wanted above some of the other goods that they wanted in their dying experience. Notice at the end, everybody ranked at the same order, dying at home. They wanted to die at home. So some similarities, some slight differences between what patients want and what physicians think they would want as they come to the end of their lives. What do family members want? This is another study from Oregon. What do family members want? They want their loved ones' wishes honored. They want to be included in the decision-making process. They need support at home as they're trying to care for their loved ones in their homes. They need support. They need help. They need assistance at home. And that may include very practical things like transportation or access to medicine or equipment, hospital beds or wheelchairs or other kinds of equipment to help transport or help move the patient within the home. They need help with bathing and toileting and feeding, those kinds of things that are still part of the patient's experience right up to the end sometimes. They need access 24/7. They need emergency access. And they don't need to be sitting on a phone waiting on somebody to answer with that awful music playing on the phone. They need access to somebody. And notice this, they want to be remembered and contacted after death. You see, death isn't the end. For the family members, death isn't the end. Death and its consequences go on for the family members. Let me talk a little bit about pain. And I want to contrast pain and suffering, because pain might be one sort of suffering, but there are other sorts of suffering. And there are ways we treat physical pain and ways we treat non-physical suffering. So let me just make this distinction. Eric Cassell, professor of medicine in New York and a physician, points out in his book, The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Medicine, that although pain and suffering are closely identified in the minds of most people and also in the medical literature, they are different in their experience. They are phenomenologically distinct. Pain and suffering are not the same thing. And if you've been in the hospital lately, or if you've been in the hospital ever, you have seen this little device or something like it, excuse me, on a scale of 1 to 10, mark or tell us what your pain experience is, so we can mark it in the charts. And we have these series of icons, these smiley faces or frowny faces to help us experience, to help us rank our experience. The problem is, or one of the problems is, that one, I can't feel your pain, so you have to report to me what your pain is. And then pain's a very idiosyncratic experience. We all have different pain thresholds. And so this chart is helpful, but it's a very crude measurement of my experience or your experience of pain. But pain is something which we can control. Pain is something which we can treat. And the way one treats pain, physical pain, is with analgesics, pain medication. We can minimize or even eliminate most of the pain, almost all of the pain that people experience toward the end of life, even if we have to render them unconscious. And so we have an entire field of medicine and care now called palliative care. Palliative care focuses on pain management and comfort for the patient. And the way, and we have shifted in our understanding of the way we do that. The old model was that we would provide life-prolonging care until somebody was imminently dying, usually within 6 months or so, they were going to be dying, and we transferred them to hospice. And that was about the best we could do. Hospice would provide comfort care for them to the end of their life, if that was necessary. But the new model, and the model that we're following now, is that as one is experiencing life prolonging care, whatever it is, maybe the level of health that you enjoy right now. At some point, you may become ill and you need palliation. You need comfort care, and you need your pain to be addressed and pain to be managed. And so we can transfer somebody to palliative care even before, long before they're dying, or even if they're not dying. Palliative care can apply or be a way of caring for patients who are experiencing chronic pain, whether or not they're dying. And then if their death is imminent, usually again within a period of 6 months, we think, then we transfer them to hospice care. And notice in the new model, bereavement, that is the experience of grieving of family members, begins even before the death of the patient. And then notice that little curve or that little angle goes past death. We realize now that care for the dying extends beyond them to their family members, and caring for the bereaving, the grieving after the death of a loved one. I have a little note to myself here that you're seeing. Language matters, and that's why it's important to know what palliative care is and what hospice is and what the difference is, and to think about what pain is and what suffering is. And language also matters at the end of life with respect to care. I've heard people say, I've heard doctors say, recently doctors say, well, there came a time in the patient's experience where we discontinued care. Now what they meant was that we discontinued treatment. There was nothing more that medicine could do. The ventilator wasn't going to help. Antibiotics were not going to help. The patient was going to die no matter what we did. So we discontinued, they said, they discontinued care. My friends, we never discontinue care. We might discontinue treatment. We can have a discussion about when that's appropriate. We might say there's nothing more that medicine can offer. There's no more medical technology that's going to help the patient live any longer. And so we're going to pull back the technology. When we make the decision to pull back the technology, we should make the same, a responsive decision to increase the amount of care. When we take people off machines, we should hold their hands, and we should be near them, because discontinuing treatment is not the same as discontinuing care. Care goes on. We never discontinue care, even if we decide that the treatment is no longer appropriate. My late friend Edmund Pellegrino, who was a great friend to the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, a great friend of Chuck Colson's, saw patients well into his 90s and wrote more than 1,000 books and journal articles in clinical ethics. Edmund Pellegrino said wisely, and with experience behind him, with the optimum and judicious use of pain management techniques, virtually no patients will experience pain that can't be relieved. So remember, one of the top concerns of people who are dying was the fear of pain. And we can say to them with confidence, your pain can be controlled. Your pain can be managed. Don't fear the physical pain. The pain is something which can be addressed, and palliative care and other services can help us do that. But there's a difference between physical pain and other forms of suffering, and sometimes they're confused. Cassell said, people in pain frequently report suffering from pain, notice, when they feel out of control. So they're experiencing physical pain, but they suffer from pain when they feel out of control, or when the pain is overwhelming, or when the source of pain is unknown. Oh no, what is that that's hurting? Or when the meaning of pain is dire, or when the pain is apparently without end. And not only so, but there are lots of different kinds of suffering. There is suffering associated with pain, as he is pointing out, but there's also emotional pain. and psychological pain and suffering. Sorry, there's physical suffering, there's emotional suffering, psychological suffering, spiritual suffering, sometimes familial suffering, the suffering of having a family that's alienated. And when suffering occurs, people describe it as feeling like they're coming apart, that feeling like they're fragmented, unraveled, that their whole world is imploded on them. That's not often a result of the physical pain. It's a result of these other features. Now, here's the reason I think that distinction is important. I'm not an MD. I'm a PhD in medical ethics, but I'm not an MD. And I can't treat myself. I can't treat physical pain. And if you're not an MD or a nurse with a license to do so, you can't treat physical pain. But everyone who's properly equipped, and Christians especially, I hope, can help people address their emotional, psychological, and spiritual suffering so that pain can be managed through the analgesics, through the pain medication, but the other forms of suffering can be addressed as well, so that, as Pellegrino said, when we address the physical pain and then address the other forms of suffering, patients can feel relief. Here's an example of the suffering soul, Job's lament. My soul loathes my life. He describes his suffering to God, and he reports his suffering, complains about his suffering, and then he uses this extraordinary metaphor. Do you pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? Job's experience of suffering is one in which he felt his whole life was being curdled. It was being soured by this experience. Or the cry of the psalmist in Psalm 88. He says, I cry out day and night. My soul is full of troubles. I'm adrift among the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your hand. That's not physical pain that he's lamenting. It is spiritual suffering that he is lamenting. I won't read this. This is from C.S. Lewis, but his experience of suffering and the loss of his wife, Joy, is a vivid account of the distinction between physical pain and other forms of suffering. Let me wrap up with a couple of theological points, and then we'll be prepared to take some questions. So, what kinds of theological truths help us address this problem of death, dying, and what's appropriate ethically at the end of life? Well, the first one is the same affirmation we make about the beginning of life. We are made in the image of God. Our lives have been invested, or better, I think, vested by God with dignity, respect, and sacred value. And dignity is not something we can lose. Death does not take away our dignity. And having to wear adult diapers, as uncomfortable as that experience may be, does not take away our dignity any more than wearing children's diapers takes away the dignity of that 6-month-old. Dignity is not something we gain or lose or can be taken away from us. God has made us in his image, and we have dignity as a result of his vesting us with that dignity. We are made in the image and likeness of God and loved by God as image bearers. And this same God, this God who has loved us and made us in his image, is the giver and sovereign of our lives. Ultimately, whatever the disease or whatever the technology, ultimately the Lord gives and takes away. He is the sovereign over our lives, and we need to be able to trust him, and our loved ones need to be able to trust him, that he knows what he's doing in the giving and the taking of life, and that we can rest in him and in his sovereign mercy and his sovereign goodness. We are not required, this is controversial, but we are not required to use every possible means to keep ourselves alive. Remember, the writer of Ecclesiastes said there's a time to live and there's a time to die. And it's perfectly appropriate for people to come to the end of their lives and say, I don't want that treatment, or I don't want that therapy, or I don't want to be put on that machine, or I want to be taken off of that machine. I have run my race, I've finished my course, and I'm ready to enter the presence of my Lord. Now, when it's appropriate to do that, and the ethics of discontinuing or withholding life-sustaining treatment and care is a thorny issue, but I'm no more obligated to use technological means to keep myself alive than I'm obligated morally, obligated ethically, to own and operate a car. Now, a car is a valuable tool for me, and it might help extend my reach, so to speak, if I need a car. But I could choose, given certain parameters, I could choose not to have a car, and it's not a moral question to have a car or not to have a car. Similarly, I could choose not to not to have a technology employed to keep me alive, and that's a decision I think can be made before God and with the counsel of the Holy Spirit and the counsel of others. A decision can be perfectly ethically appropriate. For instance, to discontinue kidney dialysis. I think there may come a time in a patient who's suffering from end-stage kidney failure, who it's an appropriate time for them to say, I don't want any more dialysis. I'm ready, and I want no more machines. We can talk about that. Next theological principle: unjust killing must be punished. Genesis 9, you can read that later. Genesis 9 says, if you kill an image bearer of God, your life will be required. And that is to say, there's a penalty for unjustly killing someone made in God's image. So that has implications for our discussion of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. If that's unjust killing, then it's wrong. It's unethical. And I would argue that assisted suicide and euthanasia are, and I have argued, that they are unethical and immoral, wrong, and that we ought to avoid those, and we ought to advocate against policies to legalize assisted suicide and euthanasia. And at the same time, so we've affirmed these other truths. It is true that Christians have the hope of eternal life and the resurrection, and don't have to be enslaved by the fear of death. I believe, and the heart's deceitful and desperately wicked, Scripture says, so I have to examine myself, but I believe, as best I know, that I don't fear death itself. Now, there are ways I'd prefer not to die, and there are experiences I'd like to avoid at the end of life, but I don't fear death itself, because death has been conquered by the Lord Jesus, and because he is the first fruits, I have the hope of the resurrection. And so to quote my favorite living poet, Wendell Berry, I want to practice resurrection now. I want to live a life of renewal and a life of hope and a life that's anticipating resurrection now, because I can live in that hope today. And then I would say, I think we have to also acknowledge that the Bible does not anywhere condone the taking of one's own life. There has to be a better way. There has to be alternatives to suicide. And suicide is not only I think ethically or morally wrong, but also it leaves a wake of grief and pain in the lives of everyone affected by the suicide of a loved one, and it's a tragedy that we have to address. So how do we make sense out of death? I'm wrapping up now. How do we make sense out of death? Well, first of all, remember it's not the way things are supposed to be. That is, God has something else in store, just as He did in the garden, and as Catholic theologian Peter Kreeft has said, sin, death, and suffering are not from God. They're from us. We misused our freedom. Our disobedience started it. And while we live in this fallen world, we have to suffer that experience. But it's not the way it was meant to be. And we have to affirm that suffering might have purpose, or it may have purpose. Lewis said, suffering is God's megaphone. Get our attention, to speak into our lives. Stanley Hauerwas, the theologian and ethicist at Duke Divinity School, says it is our capacity to feel grief and to identify with others in their grief and misfortune that helps us realize and recognize our fellow humanity. Or as the late Francis Schaeffer used to say, and it used to be echoed by Chuck Colson, it is in the way we care for the vulnerable that reveals our humanity or inhumanity. And so suffering, even if those who are experiencing it have a hard time finding purpose in suffering, it has a purpose in us because it allows us to empathize with, to care for, and to participate in the suffering of others. And puts us in touch with both our finitude, the fact that we're finite creatures, and with our dignity, as Dan Sulmacy at Georgetown University School of Medicine has put it. The good news is it's also not the way it's always going to be. We have wish we had time to spend in 2 Corinthians 4 and 5, read what Paul says there about our temporary dwelling place. In one place he calls us jars of clay. In another place he calls us a tent, our body's a tent. And he says this impermanent, temporary dwelling place is going to give way one day to a building made with God's own hands, something durable and something that will not fade away or pass away. So we can look forward to that. One last word about hospice and palliative care. A reminder, palliative care is the big category that includes any kind of management of pain or other symptoms, whether or not one is dying. And once one has been diagnosed as terminal, then hospice is often called in. Here's a distinction between hospice and palliative care. In hospice, comfort care is that which is provided, but in palliative care there may be aggressive care as well as comfort care. Both palliative care and hospice care are funded through Medicare, and for palliative care you provide it as long as is necessary for the patient, whether or not he or she passes away. And with hospice care, you provide it as long as the patient meets the criteria of being imminently dying. There's a difference in who cares for the dying patient and those who are under palliative care. Let me just tell you, my recent experience with hospice, with my mother, and with the hospice care for my dad and myself after the death of my mother has been just extraordinary. And I always was a fan of hospice, and I hope in my retirement years to volunteer for hospice, because I think there's no greater ministry than helping people prepare to die and helping their families after their death. I'll leave you with this word from Pellegrino: much of the suffering of dying patients comes from being subtly treated as non-persons. And the decision to seek assisted suicide or euthanasia, he argued, is often an indictment against those who treat or care for the patient. Here's what he means. He means if we don't care for the dying well, if we don't manage their pain and attend to their suffering, if we don't, when we withdraw treatment, increase the amount of care that we provide for dying patients, if we don't talk about dying, if we don't prepare for dying, when death comes or when death is near, we abandon the patients. We outsource the dying, and we treat them as if they are non-persons. But he says, if the emotional impediments to freedom and autonomy are removed and pain is properly relieved, if we care for them well, there is evidence, he said, that many would not choose or opt for assisted suicide and euthanasia. Excuse me. So we have an obligation and an opportunity to reform, to form again our care for the dying in such a way that people would not want their lives to be ended prematurely. Calvin, although we are happy before the resurrection, we're not happy without the resurrection. I couldn't resist on this Tuesday night of Easter celebrations, either in the Protestant or the Orthodox Church. I couldn't resist reminding ourselves that we live in the shadow of the resurrection, and therefore in its light. All right, well, that's a lot, but it may not have addressed the question that's most on your mind. So, John, tell me how we proceed next, and how can we begin to sort through some of these questions?
Well, we've got lots of great questions in. Let me go ahead and get you to stop sharing your screen if you can, Ben, and that'll make us big again magically through the power of technology. And your sound was cutting in a little bit in and out, just kind of.
Oh, no.
It wasn't, it was just the volume going up and down. So I don't know what that was, but a couple people mentioned it. I could hear it just fine on my headphones, but I'm not sure everyone could. Let me start with this. We've got wonderful questions here, but one of the things that struck me with that last quote from Pellegrino and so many other things is that doctor-assisted suicide is always sold to us on pain management. And everything you just said was that we can do that. And if you look back at Oregon, for example, which we did, facing doctor-assisted suicide in Colorado, the reasons that people identify for choosing it is always emotional pain of one kind or another.
Right. Yeah. I see. We're given two poles. You can either die an excruciating death all alone, or you can have assisted suicide and have your family surround you, and it can be a wonderful experience. Well, those are not the only two options. Mm-hmm. There is all the space in between those two options, and that includes caring for the dying well. And that, as you alluded, and as Pellegrino points out, I mean, that means that we ask doctors to do a good job of pain management, and then we surround the dying patients or dying family members, loved ones, with the love of others around them.
Yeah.
For example, my hospital here, Jackson General Hospital, is a 600-bed tertiary care medical center. We have a program here for lay people called No One Dies Alone. And we train lay people when there is a patient in the hospital who is dying, who doesn't have family members, or whose family members need to get away and go do some business and come back. We train lay people to sit with those who are dying. And if they're awake and alert, we pray with them, we read scripture, we talk to them, we watch TV with them, whatever it takes, so that no one dies alone. That seems to me to be how human beings care for other human beings when we're dying, not abandoning them or not treating them like our pet and euthanizing them. So I think there's a much better way. And by the way, you and your our listeners tonight, would be interested in the website for Americans for Better Care for the Dying. The web address is abcd-caring.org. Americans for Better Care for the Dying. We have to do a better job of caring for the dying so that people realize that their only option isn't euthanasia. This is exactly what we did with pregnancy, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I was just thinking that is that
The
we think
option
that
is
this is
not just abortion. There has to be another option.
and stopping it is not just a legislative thing.
Right.
Countering is not just a political thing. We'll put the link to that in the chat notes. Make sure you look there. We've put all the books that he mentioned, and I want to especially mention Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. It's just, I don't even know if I said that right, but it's a stunning little book.
It is, and it's very short. But I've had physicians tell me after they've read it, they said, "Why did nobody ever tell me about this book?"
Yeah, and this is, I think, one of the reasons we need to read fiction around this or great writing. I want to get into some of the practical questions here too. I appreciated, I mean, that was practical, like go volunteer at a hospital. And I was going to ask you some of that. I want you to address the question of Bishop Mike Williams. He's actually in our church in Colorado Springs and a dear friend, but he also is in charge of educating chaplains for the ACNA. So he's looking at the situation right now with COVID-19 where priests, pastors, religious clergy are not allowed to go and be present with their congregants. And if they, and he's asking questions like, what if they have their own PPE on hand, or should they, or is there anything that can be done? This is a real concern.
Yeah, no, it is a real concern, and I don't know that there's anything we can do about it at the moment. I think this is one of those matters we're going to have to address as we do the debriefing over COVID-19 down the next probably next couple of decades even as we gather information. But there does have to be a better way. But remember that the health measures are not meant to be cruel. And if you've seen any of the accounts I've seen of healthcare providers who are equally grieved that they're the ones who are having to hold the smartphone up so family members can say goodbye to one another, and the healthcare workers come out in tears. I think nobody wants it to be this way, but it's meant to protect vulnerable people, certainly not to harm others. Because look, we are used to living in our Western American bubble of individualism, and what we say is, if I want to take a risk, I should be allowed to take a risk. If I don't want to wear my seatbelt, nobody should make me. If I don't want to wear my helmet when I ride my motorcycle, nobody should make me. It's my life, my choice. But COVID-19 is not like that. COVID-19, especially because you can carry it asymptomatically, COVID-19 is not as much about our willingness to take risks as our putting others at risk. And so the question isn't, am I willing to die? The question is, am I willing to, through my carrying this virus, am I willing to put others at risk of dying?
Yeah, I appreciate
that. I know my own pastor has told me that this has been excruciating for him, and funerals have been terrible.
Yeah.
For people who our instinct, our intuition, our habit, our practice is to hug and to embrace people who are hurting, and now we can't. And to be that intermediate between God and people who are dying. I don't know what the outcome is going to be ultimately, but I don't know of exceptions to ban right now. And
You know, it's
think
something
that-
we're thinking about, that we need to get this fixed before next time. I mean, there's
Yeah,
so much
absolutely.
we're making up on the fly right now,
Right.
from every
Right.
level of government to these individual folks who are trained to be there. It would be great if maybe there could be some innovation with some hospital that would try something or something like that. It would be
Right.
interesting.
Right, and I know that chaplaincy is going to address this. I mean, there's no way they're not, and there will be groups of pastors who gather to talk about how we do a better job of this in the future.
Yeah.
It is true.
Okay.
Um,
Tim also asked a question with all the books quotes we listed somewhere. Yeah, Tim, if you go over to the chat button, all the links and all the books and things that we've mentioned so far is over there. Ben, you mentioned individualism, and that is really at the core of so many questions here. For example, you know, who best advises a family if a process or a procedure prolongs death or prolongs death? How do you know when to pull the plug? How do you know what measures are extreme measures versus life-saving measures? And a lot of times I think we approach all these questions technically, like which of these technical solutions or strategies are across some ethical line. But there, your comment on individuality struck me, because we often think like, what do I want at my time of death? As someone who's, you know, committed my life to my wife, Sarah, till death do we part, and has said, I'm no longer my own, I'm hers and she's mine. Where does the family come in? I mean, even should the patient make their own mind up on this?
well, two things about that. One is, it's a great question. One is, it is a very Western approach to things, because in Eastern cultures, these decisions are made in the company of the elders. You know, the oldest family member makes these or helps make these decisions, and the younger family members would never go against the elders. Or in some places there's much more community decision making, but in ours it is as well. So I think I think that we do have a right to determine what happens to our bodies. In fact, we have a legal right to determine what happens to our bodies. If a doctor treats a patient, a competent patient, against his or her will, legally it's battery. It is a form of battery. So we have enshrined that kind of autonomy or that kind of self-determination in the medical law. And I think generally we want to know what people would want at the end of life. That's why advanced directives are so helpful, because they allow you to think. By the way, advanced directive is never the end of the discussion. It's just meant to start the discussion. We can begin to think through, what would I want at the end of life? What kinds of things, treatments would I want? And what do I value? Is holding on to this kind of life the most important value in my life, or do I have something else to look forward to also? So, I think generally speaking, we want that. But look, as you indicated, there are implications of our decisions that trickle out, or like ripples from the center of the pool, that trickle out to others that we care about. So for instance, I understand why someone might be concerned that their assets are going to be used to prolong their lives just a few more days, those assets that could go to their family members, you know, and that they are worried about that. Now, I don't think assisted suicide or euthanasia is the way to handle that, but I understand that. I understand why people would worry that their children wouldn't get the benefits of the hard work that they've done all their lives if they die, and in the process use up tons and tons and tons of these dollars in care that's hospital care that's not going to prolong their lives significantly. So I understand those kinds of things, and so I do think that there's a place for us to certainly bring in our nearest family members, where that's appropriate. Let me give you an example of where that might not be appropriate. And this is why appointing somebody, if you have a situation like I'm about to describe, or if you're in a family member where people differ on their values, what they think is right and wrong. This is why it's so important. I was doing rounds as a medical ethicist with someone in the emergency room, and we got the call that somebody was being brought in the ambulance, and so they bring in a man, and he's unconscious, and they're working on this man in the emergency room, and a woman came with him in the ambulance. This was some years ago, so she was able to ride with him in the ambulance, and she got there, and they started barking. The caregiver started barking questions at her. Is he allergic to anything? What drugs is he on? How old is he? Has he ever had a heart event? All those kinds of questions, and they're just making assumptions that if she comes in with him, she must be a family member. Mm. Well, about 5 or 10 minutes later, another woman walks into the ER, and they say, "Who are you?" And they say, "Well, I'm his wife." Well, as it turns out, the woman who came with him in the ambulance was a woman he had been living with, and the woman who came in later was his legal wife, who would be his legal decision maker if he can't make decisions for himself. Now, if anyone had had a conversation about what he would want at the end of life most recently, it might have been the woman he was living with. But the woman who's going to make the decisions is his wife. And I'm not sure that I would want to trust my estranged wife to make decisions in my best interest. So if there are relationships with our closest relatives that are not the kinds of relationships that we want, or they don't share our values about the dignity of human life, we might want to designate someone through a durable power of attorney for healthcare, designate someone who will make those decisions if we can't, rather than our next of kin.
Okay. All right. We got just a few minutes left, so we got to hit we got to go quick. I want to try to get to maybe 2 questions if we can. Several questions on dementia, Alzheimer's, and that sort of thing. And one in particular, what if it changes someone's personality, and if that is, how does that factor into end of life care and extreme measures, and then I think some of it is how do we love people when they're just a different person, maybe cruel, maybe hard to get along with.
Yeah, it's a huge problem and a huge issue. And by the way, in the triage questions around COVID-19, that is the questions about who gets ventilators when we have only a limited number.
Right.
The question came up, should people with dementia get a ventilator above or in front of people who don't have dementia? I think many people feel uncomfortable making decisions about who gets life-sustaining treatment based upon cognitive functioning, because even though dementia has changed our personalities, we are still imagers of God, broken and not working right, perhaps, but still imagers of God. And to end a life because someone has dementia seems to me to violate our belief in the sanctity of human life. It's not the sanctity of healthy human life. It's the sanctity of every human life. But that doesn't mean that there aren't extraordinary concerns, questions, and difficulties associated with caring for people with dementia or with Alzheimer's. And I think this is a place where the church is going to have to do a better job of supporting families, of helping to provide alternatives to assisted suicide, maybe things like hospice or Alzheimer's homes for people who are going to run away from the facility. We're going to have to do a better job, because the answer will increasingly be these people don't have a sufficient quality of life, so let's end their life, or let's give them the ability, their family, the ability to end their life. And I think that's yet another tragedy.
Yeah. Last question, and please hang with us, folks. I think this is an important one. You've listed already that one of the things that pastors need to do is start working now so that we can deal with the next crisis. And we've talked too about how everyday Christians need to be involved in hospice care. That we're actually, like pregnancy care center workers did all across America, we're going to have to step up and not try to deal with this end of life thing on a legislative issue. Those were two really important things. I want to end tonight, Ben, by having you address how do we prepare ourselves for this? And specifically, are there ways that you would warn us in how we interact with technology now that is going to poison the well, so to speak, when we get to end of life technologies? In other words, counsel us on the habits we need to be forming now to die well.
Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you. And I'll try to be brief, but I'll make two quick points. One is, it's interesting. On the screen, I see the logo of the Colson Center, and at the center of that logo is a cross, or that's what I'm seeing. Isn't it interesting that one of the great emblems of our faith is a cross, and one of the great practices, the two great practices of our faith, the ordinances or sacraments of our faith, are remembrances of death and dying and resurrection. And yet we hardly talk about them in the church. We hardly address the subject of death in the church. And I think that's going to have to change. We're going to have to bring death back into the conversation of Christians and re-sanctify that conversation. The second thing is your point about technology. I think we have assumed in the 21st century that technology is a fix for everything, and if this technology doesn't fix it, we'll get a technology to fix that technology. We layer technology on technology in our quest for efficiency, and even efficiency in this particular question. But I think we're going to have to rethink our penchant for technology as a utopian answer, and efficiency as the highest value. There are some things I want governed by efficiency. I'd like crunching numbers and doing data to be assisted by technology, but my wife and I have been married 45 years in August. And if she sat across our anniversary dinner table and she said to me, "Ben, you've been one of the most efficient husbands." Or if your children said to you, "Dad, I want you to know you're twice as efficient as the dad down the street." Well, how do we take that? Is that, it's a category mistake, isn't it? Dadding or parenting and being a spouse is not something governed by efficiency. We value human relations not by their efficiency, but by their depth and by the level of their care and concern. And I think this is another matter. We're gonna have to not trust technology to fix this for us. We are going to die. So instead of looking for the techno fix, I need to strengthen my relationships and deepen my relationships with others, because that's what matters in human life. The technology notwithstanding. Ask those people who don't have a smartphone let me change it. Ask people who have a smartphone how that helps you when you're dying. It's a tool for other things, but not to prepare me for dying. And people without them probably die better in those cases. So I think that's something that's worth additional reflection, John. That's something we need to continue to think about, is how do we prepare for dying in light of our technophilia, our love of technology.
You know, now would be a great time for pastors to preach on death. This is
Yeah.
front and center, and talk about the relevance of the gospel. And I appreciated that word, Ben. You actually answered a question that someone asked about being an older generation and more used to seeing death and experiencing that as a young person. And now we have a younger generation, and we're seeing the inability that they have to process even the inconvenience, much less the death around them. Well, look, we could go on and on, but we are out of time. And I appreciate, Ben, the fact that you gave us this framework. Both here's where we're at in history when it comes to these topics. Here's what we've got to work with, and here's ultimately the theological grounding that we need to plant our feet on. We will send off a link to this, to the recording of tonight, as well as a link where you can review the details of Dr. Mitchell's PowerPoint slides, and we'll also include this Q&A. Feel free to share this with whoever. Please just don't post it on social media. If you would avoid doing that, that would be great. Dr. Mitchell, it's good to see you. I'm glad you're well, and I was really grateful for everything that you did tonight.
Thank you. I'm grateful for you, John, and I'm grateful for the listeners who and participants. And if I can help in any way in the future, please contact me. I'm easy to find and on the Union website, and that's uu.edu. And I'd be very happy to help in any way that I can. Thank you for the conversation tonight.
We'll send that website out with all the course links along with tomorrow, Union University, uu.edu. God bless everyone. We'll see you next week as we wrap up the course. Thanks. Have a good night.
Bye now.